Welcome to Monday Morning Coffee with Inside the Firm. Each week, our hosts will be interviewing local, regional, and national business leaders to give you an inside peek into how they lead their business to success in the ever-competitive business climate.
Welcome to another episode of Inside the Firm. I'm your host, Alex Gore. I am joined by founder and CEO of Indigo River, Dena Prastos, who is the first waterfront architect, trailblazing a new category in the industry: waterfront architecture, civil engineering, futurist, climate adaptation expert, entrepreneur, and creative original. Dena is driven to boldly transform the built world at the water's edge, specializing in New York Harbor. Welcome inside the firm.
Thank you so much for having me, Alex. It's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so you have a degree in architecture, license in architecture. So you went through the grinding nonsense that is those tests. Congratulations.
I absolutely did. Yes, thank you.
But you also have a graduate degree in civil engineering. So could you talk about why architecture? You must have gone to architecture school first.
Yeah, I did a 5-year undergrad program at NJIT, and I finished, and almost immediately, actually before I even finished the program, I knew I wanted a more technical understanding, and I loved architecture school. I did very well in my program, but just my own curiosities and securities, I wanted to have a more technical understanding of different structural systems. Calatrava was always an inspiration. And so before I even finished my undergrad program, I started taking bridge courses to also get a master's in civil engineering.
Are you familiar with, and this is just a curious question, is the master's program similar to what you'd have to do with an undergraduate program? Because, for example, I teach in the engineering department at CU Boulder, and it's civil engineering, but it's basically a foundation in engineering. So they take a whole bunch of different engineering courses and have to do that. Did you have to do a similar thing, or was it more focused?
So I did do something similar. So it's standing completely apart. I mean, I overlapped a lot of the programs and took very full schedules and took summer courses as well. But if I had taken the programs completely independently, I would have taken a 5-year undergrad for architecture and a 2-year master's program for civil engineering. And prior to being able to take some of those master's level program or courses, I would have had to, and I did, take higher level math, higher level physics to be able to be eligible to take the master level courses in civil engineering.
Right. And some people might not know this. If you get a civil engineering degree in college, a lot of structural engineers do that. They go through that route, take their PE and all that. So did you pursue getting your professional, the PE, professional engineering
license? No, I did not. So to be truthful, when I finished school, I didn't know that I wanted to be licensed in either or architecture or engineering, and I didn't sit for the FE either, which usually engineering students sit either during or right after school while everything is fresh. But for the first, I'd say, 8 years of my career, my peers were all engineers. So I worked for 6 years in the field for a contractor as a field engineer, project engineer, quality control manager overseas. And all of my peers were engineers. I didn't work with any architects. Certainly my first job. My second job, there was one other kind of individual who had architecture background, but by and large, I was working with engineers, and it was from traditional civil engineers, geotechnical engineers, marine engineers, coastal engineers, kind of an array that I continue to work with now. But I was the only architect background, and I didn't really I didn't even look to get licensed until I thought, I'm in a niche here, and there's a specialty, there's an opportunity, and I can open a firm. But to do that, I certainly need to be licensed. And so it wasn't until, 8-10 years after school that I even really sat to take the tests and get my license.
So, knowing a little bit more about your background and how engineering/construction, it seems like it was very construction focused/problem solving focused.
It was, early on especially.
And then it seemed to kind of split back off into the architectural realm and come at it from that perspective. It makes sense, but it also doesn't make sense. It makes sense of like, okay, that's the way you're trained, that's the way you think, problem solving, iteration. But you could have went the other way. You could have went down the PE. So what was your decision? What was your thought process?
I've always identified as an architect, and I think one of the main differences is in that, design element, in that iterative element that you touched on, and not necessarily only a problem solving or technical problem solving skill set. And so when I finished engineering, and yes, I surrounded myself with engineers, I wanted, again, as an architect, to have a more technical understanding and a more practical understanding. So it wasn't, design top down forcing things, but really understanding ground up what are the structures, what are the systems, what are the practicalities of how things go together, who are the people putting them together in the field, and what are their thoughts, what are their conversations about different design schemes and materials and methodologies. And so it really was out of a kind of insecurity / curiosity that I, from this, architecture foundation, wanted this more technical understanding, but only to be able to come back to design with that more technical understanding and different range of experiences and exposures.
Do you feel that waterfront architecture and design needs a more deeper technical understanding? And the reason why I ask is because you need a technical understanding for houses. You need them for 4 or 5 stories. Once you get up to like skyscrapers, you need even more of a technical understanding. But so I've worked in New York, and I mean, it's engineering heavy on, we do a fancy design at Leapskin, and then they figure out how to do it. But there's still more of a, hey, a skyscraper can only fit in this form on this lot, where, excuse me, and correct me if I'm wrong, waterfront architecture seems like, hey, it's this whole line that is blurred between the water and land, and it's probably not just continuous on one property, even though it might be because that's who you're working with, the client. And it's not going to be this just, I know that there's probably systems for piers and stuff like that, but it doesn't seem as cookie cutter. It seems like you really need to solve the technical first, and then somehow adapt that to humanity, scale, size, people, proportions, all that other stuff too.
Sure,
and you might not know that coming just from architecture over. Does that
yeah,
make
if I
sense?
would have, it does. And if I would have kind of jumped off from my architecture undergrad education and, maybe jumped right into a firm that did waterfront architecture, maybe I would have had a good enough technical understanding, but no firms existed. And my general sentiment is that architecture as a profession, yes, we are generalists. Yes, we know a little bit about a lot, but I still believe deeply that there is room and opportunity, and for the betterment of what we do, protecting this health, safety, and welfare of the public in the built environment, looking at what that built environment is and specializing in different facets of it. So I think certainly having a generous knowledge is helpful, and if you've gone through the examination process for architecture, no matter what your background is, there are things that come up that you've never had exposure to, but you learn enough to know how to think about them like an architect. And I think that's true also of other fields that are atypical, not the normal building architecture, but where architects are certainly asserting their agency and having a positive impact on that built environment.
Tangent thought. So I know you probably deal with it, and we can probably go into this later, a lot of the waterfront architecture, but you've probably seen proposals for the past 20 years, and a lot of them never come to fruition, about making islands
Floating
off the
cities, yeah.
floating cities. And
Yes.
what's kind of funny to me about it is I always love the idea, and it's always funny because it's always California, maybe Florida. I don't know if New York has any of this, but it's because of location. So from Colorado, I drive to Minnesota to see my family every year, and then through Iowa, right? So from Colorado to basically Wisconsin, and then from Colorado up to Canada, there is a lot of space. There is plenty of space. People do not, I've 20 times, 20 different routes. I always love driving through all the cornfields, but yet there's still this appealing idea of floating islands, or islands that are connected. What is your thought on that? Does any of that come across your desk? Do you see a future
Yep.
in any of that?
Absolutely. I do believe floating structures, floating islands are a great opportunity for the future. And if for no other reason than a lot of what I work with in my space are different vulnerabilities and different environmental hazards, including sea level rise and flooding, and knowing that I think it's something like 80% of our population lives in coastal areas in this country. So if we're looking at that, and most of our infrastructure, if not all, is fixed. Very little of it is able to adapt to sea level rise. But inherently, a floating structure does, because as the tide rises or as the sea level rises, so does the floating structure. So there's opportunity certainly to look at some of our coastal areas and offshore areas for solutions that are floating. What that then does, though, for me is it really begs the question of where some of these areas, I've seen concepts, out in the middle of the ocean for offshore floating cities, and it really starts to question, if these aren't international waters, and what are the kind of nationalist questions, and what are the regulatory bodies that have jurisdiction, and it brings up kind of bigger governmental questions, not necessarily just about the structures, but the structures kind of spark that thought of, well, then what?
Yeah. Then
So
you get
that's,
Bitcoiners
there's
involved.
a future.
And
Absolutely.
then once you get
Then you have,
Bitcoiners involved, then it goes
yeah, or
crazy.
Peter Thiel building off the coast of California. Yeah, you have a lot of that's kind of abstract, and people don't take it seriously. But I think there are roots there for, seeds for the future.
So, so you honestly think, and I do too, even knowing, what I know about the Midwest, I still see it as an appealing idea. So do you think it's something that could be practical? Or
Absolutely.
actually what's the likelihood of something like that happening in the next 10 years or 20 years?
I think it depends on the population size that we're looking at, because there's a lot of conversation around migration also, and climate migration and climate refugees. And so there's certainly opportunity there. There's also plenty of, as you said, untapped land. So there are opportunities there as well to relocate people, which is a kind of a polarizing topic at large. But within the next 10 years, I mean, it depends on the scale, because there certainly are different modules now that are available that aren't classified as vessels. They're classified as, floating homes or whatnot, and they have pneumatic pumps that'll elevate the structure above if there's a hurricane or something, so that it's not subject to wave forces. So there are structures out there in their infancy for smaller scale applications. It's a matter of thinking of, well, what if we do this for our whole city or a whole town or a whole village, and start there and then iterate on it. And as a tangent but related, I was a keynote this past weekend for it was called the Future Cities competition in New Jersey. It's a national competition, but it was the New Jersey branch of it. And it was middle schoolers that were looking at, future concepts for cities. And they had models. They were phenomenal, super inspirational. But almost all of them incorporated floating cities, which was interesting, especially interesting to me. But even without having my background, I think it was a key point just to think, these are the next generation, and that's what they're looking at for 100 years out.
Yeah. Are you seeing, and this will relate to an on-land question, are you seeing a trend on these floating cities to have the structures independent of the infrastructure, meaning what you were talking about floating, or to have them sort of locked, because I'm thinking waves and all that as more of a superstructure.
So they have both. There are systems that are floating. It depends on the size and it depends on the wave climate, certainly. But there are other systems that are more, they're adaptable to different elevations, but they're more fixed on a routine basis. So they have the ability to be raised over time, but on a day-to-day, they are fixed, if that makes sense. So they're not floating like a ferry landing that you're on and you can feel, the waves rocking it. They're elevated above the water, but they have the ability to elevate even higher as needed.
Are they on piers, caissons, whatever you want to call, or are they like piles? They're
so actually two systems. So piles, certainly for a more fixed system, piles that they can kind of jack up. Like if you've ever seen waterfront construction, they have jack up barges that they can have a still platform for a crane to be on while they're setting a piece. But then after, the shift is done, they can lower the barge again, and it's, it's floating. It's still on piles, but it's moving up and down with the wave environment. The other application, certainly they have catenary anchors that are, underwater, and they have multiple of them, and they have enough flex in them to be able to move with the wave environment. So there are different systems out there, and none of them are new per se, but the application of how we look to use them certainly is and will be.
What is your opinion of some of the islands in Dubai, the ones detached, like the Earth, the palms? There's multiple palms. I'm sure there's some other ones. So two-part question. What's your opinion of those? Is that a concept that could be applied over to the United States? Let's take Florida, California, or, you know, not to negate North Carolina or any of those other states, but let's just start there. Possibly Texas, why not? To take a similar idea, but could you use a similar idea but detach it? Meaning, hey, it's 800 to 1,000 feet off, but it's still making islands. Because I think one of the appeals of offshoring is, hey, the government isn't quick to change laws, change policies, to adapt or anything like that. And that's one use case is, hey, foreigners that are close that might be able to easily be in the time zone, something like that. But let's just stick to the two questions of what's your thoughts about those developments, and then are they adaptable or practical here?
So certainly inspiration to draw from on different levels, but essentially what you're talking about is filling the waterways or carving land to allow for new canal systems. And that's not necessarily new either. I mean, certainly making it in the shape of, a plan of the earth or a palm tree or whatever adds, from space, you can see it. Great. Okay. There's aerials of it, but and we've participated in competitions in the Middle East also, where we look at either carving out land or filling land or filling islands they're not floating structures, they're islands, they're filled with material, and then we build on them. So that's, I don't think it's particularly new or groundbreaking. In this country here, one of the challenges that we have is our regulatory system around the waterfront and around the habitat and the environment is so stringent. And so filling, I mean, if it's one thing, if it's like beach replenishment or renourishment that it's been, eroding because of the wave climate and because of the wave patterns, and filling in coastal areas, that's one thing. But certainly filling new islands or creating new land is frowned upon by many of our regulatory bodies.
Not a thing the government's going to let you.
It's an uphill battle, and for different reasons, but it's not a quick fix to say.
Okay, noted. Going back onto land, what are some of the things that you're seeing or doing to deal with the waterfront issues? And is the main strategy, let's say sea level rises or fluctuations in storms, to stop and keep that water out? Or is there a secondary, and this is literally coming from zero knowledge whatsoever.
Yeah.
So if any of these questions seem dumb, it's because they probably are.
Not at all, no.
Is there a secondary, like, hey, buildings should be able to keep water out or adapt to water pressure, or, float in a crazy idea, but then you're disconnecting from the infrastructure. So what's going on there?
So on the waterfront, yes, we see different extreme and harsh environments, natural environments and hazards. So the waterfront in general is a very vulnerable typology. And because of that, we do have lots of different solutions for, I would say, working with the water, not necessarily working to keep the water out, but anticipating that, sure, sea level will rise or the wave climate will be so extreme that the water will overtop whatever the infrastructure is, if it's a bulkhead or a seawall or a whatever that coastline or shoreline structure is. So we have a very, I'll say, organic thought process around allowing water to inundate, because we're not going to at large design things that are stronger than nature. At some point in time, nature will win. Nature is persistent. It is stronger than any forces that we will ever be able to sustain. So it's something that it's more a mentality, and we do apply it to buildings upland. And so because we're always working on with next to near the water, when we work on upland, even landlocked sites, but we're looking particularly at flood inundation or the stormwater drainage and what's happening on king tides and why are these buildings flooding, we start to look at, there's two methodologies. You dry flood proof, where you keep the water out, which is by and large the last couple generations that has been the strategy of water doesn't come in buildings. And more recently, we look to, sometimes we require waivers or variances to do this depending on the use of the building and the occupancy of the building, but we'll look to allow the water to come in different ways, or to strategize where we want the water to go and keep some areas dry, but allow other areas to get wet. And so there's kind of sacrificial spaces that we look to create. And that methodology, I feel, is more recent. It's not, again, that's, since Middle Ages, that's been in architecture, that sometimes there's different extreme environments where the water comes in and then it recedes out. Fine. The recent application and the recent challenge is, because we have so many codes, and we have FEMA and we have NFIP, and we have underwriting from federal banks for loans to do construction, and what they require for the flood mitigation and the codes around the flood prevention are very stringent and by and large black and white, unless you have the creativity to see otherwise and apply for variances and waivers, which is often what we find ourselves doing, is finding a way to allow nature to do what it's going to do anyway and not fight it, just to allow it and focus where that's going to happen so that it's not causing excessive damage or putting anyone in harm's way.
Doesn't Florence, or maybe I'm getting the city wrong, in Italy?
Venice is a canal city. Yeah.
And doesn't it flood and come up 2 to 3 feet, and just the shops are just like, people are having coffee in a foot or two.
More extreme lately, but it's had that design, and much of that construction has been around for hundreds of years, not decades, that we have kind of in this country that our infrastructure is getting replaced already. Within a 50-year time span, we're looking at 500 years of infrastructure improvements.
Yeah. When that happens in Venice, is that a seasonal thing? Is that a tide thing?
It's a tide thing, and it is happening more and more frequently as related to sea level rise at large.
Gotcha. Have you looked at this? I want to say it's only 2 years old, but I actually don't know the time frame, especially since like COVID interrupted everyone's life. It's like, was this pre-COVID or
time
before?
warp?
Yeah, time warp. Did that year exist? Who knows? Bjork-Ingels's big architecture group, if that's what they're still called, did some sort of proposal for New York City, the waterfront. And I think one of their ideas was expanding out and making a green buffer zone. Could you talk about that, the practicality of that, the realisticness of that? What are your thoughts?
Sure. So I think what you're talking about is the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project, which they had in its concept, I believe it was called the Big U. And that is a project that's actually a project that we work on. We have a very limited scope in what we do on it, and it's more related to the construction side of sequencing and logistics, and barge support. But the premise of that was, building a buffer zone, building a perimeter barrier that would take that wave force or that wave action and keep it out. And it was a polarizing concept, and it's been gone through design development. And so it's not that they've built out now, but they've figured out different zones that they can contain or protect more tightly. And that's the idea of building out isn't new either, and not even in New York City. I mean, much of Battery Park City is fill, and that's fill from the original World Trade Center tower construction. And so it's harder now to fill out and change the landform that is Manhattan or any of the New York City shoreline, which there's 520 miles of, but it is something that is done on occasion. Usually regulatory bodies will require mitigation, whether on-site or off-site, as you start to encroach into the waterways.
Is that, I mean, I'm sorry for all my amateur questions, but by filling out, what are you doing? Are you just like, are you capturing the waves? Are you making it higher for it to crest over? What's the mechanism that's protecting the city there?
So it could be a number of things. It could also depend on what the programming is or what the elevation desires are for what elevation you want the land to be at, or what you want the access to be, if you're allowing access to enable people to get into the water. It can also do with what is happening upland and what buffer zone you need for a setback from the upland, from the coastline. And so if that coastline changes, your setback can change. And so there are things that go through a lot of different regulatory bodies and agencies having jurisdiction. But one of the environmental bodies that pushes back most is Department of Environmental Conservation, because they're losing habitat when individuals fill out into the waterway for whatever reason, whether it is to change the elevation or to change the access or to change the parameters for an upland building of where it can be positioned or what size it can be. So there are various motivations for filling out, as I'm calling it, but changing the edge of the water condition. And sometimes it could be that you're not, same way that on a site, I don't know which version of the architecture exam you had done, but you remember like the cut fill question where the goal was to balance and equalize, the cut and fill on any given site, so you're not carting away or disposing of materials, and you're keeping the native environmental habitat kind of holistically there. Same thing with the water. So if you're filling out in one area, you're probably cutting back elsewhere. And you may also do that to change, if you're trying to protect and create a marine environment, you may create a quay or a wharf or something that blocks wave action from entering the marina. So you're changing the shoreline, the natural topography of what that shape and what the hydrography underneath the shoreline also of what that riverbed looks like, to change the wave action or to change the depth for boats coming in, vessels leaving. So there are a number of reasons that you can change what that edge looks like in plan, as well as the elevation of that edge as it moves from water upland.
Gotcha. Changing kind of topics. I found this on your website. It was a statement. I'll read it. As we enter the fourth industrial revolution, defined by technology which fuses the physical, digital, and biological worlds, we believe that now more than ever, a single idea can have a butterfly effect, that each project can create global impact. So my question is, I've heard you talk about before, but recreating the architectural role in society. To you, what would that look like?
So I wouldn't ever want to self-limit what the profession can do. I believe that the way that architects think is unique, and there is value to society for it. So again, bringing us back to what an architect is licensed to do, not necessarily what the public thinks we do, or what even students signing up to be an architect understand at that time. I certainly didn't, but we're licensed to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public in the built environment. And so a couple pieces of that. One is, the health and safety aspects of that, of what we're protecting health and safety of the public. A lot of that, and especially recently, and I anticipate even more in the future, a lot of that is regulated by code. So it's no longer that we're, designing from scratch and we don't have standards or guidelines or codes to tie us back to or use as a baseline. So I believe that the architect's role in the future will be still focused on health and safety, but there will be a lot more tools at our disposal and resources at our disposal to help that. And certainly with the advancement of digitization and the different tools that we have, being able to automate that, and certainly looking at AI as well for some of that we don't need to come up with so many different concepts. We can set the parameters that we know are fine-tuned for health and safety, and have AI output, thousands of different options, and then rank them based on our parameters. So we can start to focus more on the outcome and not necessarily all of the early preliminary work that we can now automate. The other part of that is the welfare component. So welfare is really hard to define. And when we look at society and what is protecting the welfare of the public look like, what does that mean for an architect? Well, what are applications, and not malintended, but what are applications where we've had poor results? Certainly we have, zoning scenarios where highways went up and we had different zoned areas, and we have different communities and disadvantaged communities, and that wasn't intentional, but we've observed it. And so certainly when we look at welfare, I think planning is a big part of that. I also think on a much smaller scale, we have to be, as architects, more active in our regulation, in our codes, writing our codes, rewriting our codes, because when we look at stadiums built in the 50s that were based on codes from the 40s, and we go to these stadiums now 50, 60 years later with our families, and they're only changing tables that were spec'd and by code, by law, required to be in the women's changing room, that has an effect on today's society. Unless we go back and update our code and update our venues and update all of the restrooms to have equal amount of changing rooms, that responsibility falls disproportionately to women oftentimes, and that's a direct result of our built environment reflecting a code that at the time it was normal that women were homemakers, and the men were not, and they were at work. And so when they went out to a sporting event or stadium together, these responsibilities for childcare still fell to the women. That's outdated in today's society. Well, we haven't been proactive enough as a profession to update our codes, to update the regulation, to change the guidelines and overwrite them to reflect today's values. And it's something that's always changing. We can't pinpoint what welfare looks like, but we can certainly look back and say, well, we were going in the wrong direction, or we didn't course correct quick enough. And so I think there are a lot of opportunities to assert our agency in other ways from the typical role of the architect designing, whether it's residential or commercial, whatever those buildings are. There are other applications for our skills that include in the regulatory environment and include, when we talk about built environment, that doesn't only mean buildings, that's anything man-made. That includes systems, that includes the digital world, the virtual world. And we look at some of the madness that's going on with social media and its effect on especially young children and teenagers today. Well, who designing those systems, who designing that built environment was looking out for the health, safety, and welfare of the public. There were no architects per se in that model. And so I think we need to charge ourselves with modernizing leveraging our skill set to modernize how we can assert our agency for the betterment of the public. And so I think there are a lot of different applications, certainly, to continue within the built environment as, traditionally defined to be buildings, but certainly infrastructure, certainly the digital world, certainly the regulatory world. There are a lot of different ways for architects to assert agency, again, for the betterment, not only of the public, but for the planet and for the profession as well.
So I want to expand on that and then circle back and really focus on that, because to me, when you started expanding on digital and health, safety, and welfare, I immediately went to sort of our messed up food guidelines.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Our food systems. Yes.
Our food systems. And there was a recent study. It was something like Cocoa Puffs were more healthy. So this is a processed, highly sugared thing than lean chicken. And I'm not making a judgment on vegan or not, or animal, but it is, if everyone was true in their heart, a very highly sugared processed Cocoa Puffs is not healthier than chicken. Like
right.
I don't care what study they did, it is incorrect, right? So we could keep expanding that, but let's say, whoever the next president of the United States is, and society's getting so crazy, it becomes a dictator, and Dena's in charge of this now. So you got tasked to be in charge of this. And I'm not asking for solutions, but meaning like, hey, change exactly this. What would you start to set up? Because I think what you're getting for, and there's real big challenges in the code. There's real big challenges in the supply system. Not just that's such a big thing, but like you can only build what you can make practically. Like there might be a great solution, but unless a factory is making that's going to be so expensive that even though it's healthier for the climate, better for the people, all that, it might be literally 1,000 times more expensive, even though it's using simple ingredients, because there's not a factory making 1 million tons of that, right? That would then help out. But going back so I understand why code is, I understand why they keep glomming on, but sometimes it can come to a detriment. And this comes with, I'm in Colorado, so there's a lot of wells, right? And I honestly think we should be, if we're going to use oil, and we are going to use oil, that I think it's in America and we should have it come from America. But they'll say, hey, these are all safe. We have 400 different regulations and checkpoints. So I went and looked at it because like I live where these things are. And like 90% of them is it painted correctly? It's like, I'm not concerned about that. I'm concerned about the gas coming, like I'm concerned about this other stuff. So, and maybe I'm spoon feeding the solution too much. So feel free to tangent or say no, but would one idea be, hey, all these codes that have very specific things, if we focus on health, safety, and welfare and re-looked at it and rewrote it, it might actually get to the point and allow some creativity. Obviously, there's a cost to that people will take advantage of that. What's your thoughts on the ramblings?
One thing I want to zero in on is your comment, because in many ways you're right, but I would challenge the way that we operate in our value system. So you mentioned eating healthy at its core is more expensive. Well,
no, I don't think it is.
Well, no, it can be, but in what unit of measure? Are we only talking money, or are we talking our health as individual humans, our health as society, our health as a planet? I think there are a lot of different units of measures and values that we have to layer on, and we cannot only be looking at the monetary of the expense in terms of dollars. So that's one just kind of mindset shift that I think as a country, certainly we could benefit from, of not only considering, and sure, it's easy to say when you have money or when you don't have money. Well, yes, but our habits, we eat a lot of processed food, and it's not good for us, and it does affect us. And the long-term implications are, maybe it's not this generation, but another generation will pick up the tab in the healthcare. And we look at what happened certainly in the pandemic with regards to supply chain of demand and what's available and what the lead times were and what the carbon footprint was of getting materials here. And it started to, really exemplify different broken areas within our system that we hadn't had a reason, not that we didn't have a reason, but we hadn't taken the opportunity to really look deeply at. And so certainly I think a large part of a more positive future would be to localize a lot of our resources and localize a lot of our agriculture and localize that process and reconnect with what our food is. Not, if you're familiar with Michael Pollan, not food like substances, but what food is and where it comes from and what the nutrients are in it, and how you can look at two different packets of chicken, and one is raised in a factory and the other is free range organic. And sure, it'll say the same protein, it'll say the same, the nutrition label will be the same, but the quality of those nutritional items are completely different, and your body's ability to metabolize them and get nourishment from them is a completely different outcome. And so we've often standardized things to make them black and white, even with our codes of, check the box here or there, but then we're not giving ourselves, like you said, the freedom to be creative, to really get to the better results, because we're shortcutting a lot of things with, checking these boxes, or it applies or it doesn't. But if we are more involved in our own, especially as architects, more involved in politics, I think it would do well for the world. Because we do see a lot of these different systems. We are generous in many regards, but the way it comes together and the advantage that we have within society is unlike any other profession. And we're certainly not recognized as that, but we add value. And I would, a whole nother podcast topic on how we value our own services and what the business model is for architecture and why that's broken. But we certainly can look to be more creative in the way that we assert our agency and the way that we derive value for ourselves and for our communities for it.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. So going back, what would be kind of your first step or first action item moving towards this way that would make an impact?
So localizing resources would be kind of the header topic, and that would come in the form of not only certainly localized agriculture, but also emergency management centers, because every zone and around our country, we have so many different vulnerabilities and hazards that we deal with, that there isn't a, one size fits all to blanket, broad brush the entire country with. There are different emergency scenarios that we all face. And so having localized emergency hubs that you're not waiting on this national FEMA to come in and save you. There are localized hubs that are prepared for the hazards in your area, and that you're a community member and you're trained in them. You know how to help, you know where to go for help. That kind of first step of localizing where you're drawing from, I believe would help. And it also in terms of our carbon footprint sustainability, but it'll allow us and enable us to be more resilient in the long run.
I agree. Do you also agree then for localizing or bringing back manufacturing?
I certainly think there are applications. I mean, there are, I would say, if we can focus more thoughtfully on globalizing information and sharing information, and then localizing our resources and localizing that supply chain for what our area needs, we will be better off.
Absolutely. Well, great. Well, thank you for being on the show. Let's leave with this. Any other thoughts that you want our listeners to know or that we didn't explore? And then after that, how to connect, social media or anything that you want to shout out that way?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I think one thing that can put into perspective some of what we've been talking about abstractly is to think very critically about ourselves and how and specifically where we're spending our money. Because if we follow how we're spending our money, we'll see where our impacts lie. So if we're buying, and I buy things on Amazon, sure, but if we're buying everything on Amazon and everything from these big box manufacturers, that money isn't going into our local community. And there would be a greater benefit if it were. And I mean, again, capitalist America, all for small businesses, and we must invest in them. And so where we follow our money and where we can look at how we're spending our money, I think most critically will help us understand our behavioral and our habits and why things are trending the way that they are.
This is a controversial statement, but I believe it to be extremely true. You have way more power in your dollar than your vote.
Yeah.
Meaning if you used your dollar right, your vote really probably wouldn't matter.
Yeah. I follow that.
Okay, where to connect or follow or see your work?
So I'm certainly our website, indigoriver.com. I'm available on LinkedIn, on social media. My handle is, I think, just my name, Dena Prastos. Also, we have Indigo River on social media and Instagram and Twitter. So yeah, I'm around.
All right. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Alex. My pleasure.
Bring me to life.